Welcome to today's SANS webcast. Why is packet capture important for Zero Trust? Sponsored by Endace. My name is Mary Lynn Gollier of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams, SANS Senior Instructor, Michael Morris, Director of Technology Alliances at Endace, and Mark Evans, VP of Marketing at Endace.
Hey, thanks so much, Mary. Really appreciate it. Folks, as Mary mentioned, my name is Jake Williams. I'm joined today by Michael Morris and Mark Evans, both from Endace. Before I give them a chance to introduce themselves, because I definitely will, I want to yet again thank Endace for sponsoring this, not only this webcast, but now two full series of webcasts, right, that we've done over a 2-year period, where they've really encouraged us to bring stuff that educates the audience, right? And I guess that's true for a lot of webcasts. Folks say, yeah, educate them on a product, right? But no, here we're talking about process, right? It is very odd that I have in fact, I can't remember another time we've had a vendor come to us and say, hey, we recognize that we need to educate the community, or we want to educate the community, we recognize the value in that, versus just doing product pitch stuff. I want to thank these guys for that, because it's been a fantastic run, and really appreciate them bringing this content to the SANS community. That said, let me kick it over to Michael to introduce himself, and then of course we'll kick it to Mark. Michael, take it away, man.
Hey, thanks, Jake, and certainly appreciate you taking the time to educate with us the community around the value of packet data for a slew of cybersecurity things. And obviously today we're focusing on zero trust environments and how it can really be a differentiator for those environments. So again, thank you, Jake.
Hi, I'm Mark. I look after marketing at Endace, and I'll reiterate what Michael said. Thank you, SANS and Jake. We do think it's really important that people understand the value of packets. Thankfully, we're seeing an increase in the demand for that, which is good for us, but also good for the cyber community, I think. So the more that we can get the message out there that, if you've got packets, you can do stuff that you just can't do if you don't have them, the better. So we're all about that.
Yep.
Thanks.
No, that's awesome. Awesome. And by the way, too, I want to stand by. Sorry, Mark, I didn't mean to jump in there. I stand by, that is really the case, right? There are a lot of things, and we'll talk a little bit more about this today, but there's a lot of stuff that I can do with packets that I really can't do with anything else. And yet again, I'm going to walk you through a case study in that today. We do want to talk about zero trust networking, though, because this is such a hot topic. If you had asked me at the end of, let's say 2020, they're like, somebody came to me and they're like, Jake, what do you think will be in one of the first executive orders, right, to come out of the Biden administration? The word zero trust would not have been there. There were lots of things I expected, right, but zero trust was not what I expected. And yet here we are, right? And so zero trust, and taking the politics out of this, right, the fact that we have politicians who, honest to goodness, do not understand the word zero trust, right? Heck, half our community doesn't understand what zero trust is, let alone politicians. But the fact that it's been elevated to that level where they are talking about it tells us a lot, right? Regardless of what you think about zero trust as a marketing term or a vendor term or whatever, understand that it is effective, right? And so we are going to talk a little about that, getting started with it, and then we'll take a look at how do I get into building out those configurations. Because folks, one of the things you need to know, if you take nothing else away from this webinar besides Endace is awesome, if you take nothing else away from the webinar, understand there is not a product out there that will do zero trust for you, right? There are products out there that can help you implement a zero trust networking strategy, right? But they won't do it for you, right? Again, they're a tool, basically, that you can use. But yes, anywho, I think it's clear, we've seen it over the years, both these gentlemen have seen it too, I'm sure, that traditional paradigm of, block the bad, it's not working. It's just not working. We know it's not working. It's inherently reactive, right? It has to be, because we have to know what bad looks like before we can block it, meaning we have to be reacting to something in that environment. If you're trying to define zero trust, right? I know there's folks who are constantly authenticate, and I'm like, what does that mean, right? Like, walk me through that piece. And so I love to explain to everybody and say, look, particularly as we think networking, I want you to think about denial, permit by exception. We've known this was the route we needed to go for decades. The reality is it's hard. And while tools can make it easier, it's still hard. And honestly, if it were easy, we'd already be doing it. When you already know what good looks like, right? When only known good is what's supported, everything else you see is immediately suspect. I do want to note here that folks have abused this term, particularly vendors have abused this term, right? That executive order certainly helped with the abuse, helped accelerate the abuse of the term. But I do want to claim here, and I do want to note that we're not claiming that we're not jumping on the bandwagon here, right? We've been, and I'm sure, Michael, I talked to you about this, I think back at Black Hat, right? Where it's like, for so long, we've heard people talk about zero trust, don't really know what it means. And you feel like, well, what should be there? No, go to the packets. That's a great place to start. Is what's on your network today? And Michael, do you want to speak a little bit to this?
Well, I think you kind of hit it in the beginning. No product in itself can solve the problem, right? Mm-hmm. It's actually a philosophy or a paradigm shift in how you architect your infrastructure, how you implement tools and applications, how you connect your users to those applications, and you've got to approach it as a paradigm shift and a philosophical approach to how your infrastructure is built and used. And that's, like you said, no one tool, no one firewall, no one application is going to solve it, because there's so many moving parts. Mm-hmm. But you've got to approach it with that, and you got to take steps along a path. I liken it to a journey of how do we improve our zero trust infrastructure and processes each year that goes by, right? Because it's not something you can just flip a switch and boom, you're zero trusted. It doesn't work that way.
I usually joke about it being like that math problem in high school calculus, where the that equation doesn't solve to zero, but it's a number infinitely approaching zero, right? So we never get to zero trust, but we try. I love the journey piece of it too.
Near zero trust.
What's that?
Near zero trust.
Near zero trust. I like it, right? But I think what Mark said there, what Michael said there, really does kind of pivot back a little bit to, this may not be something, it's like how to eat an elephant, the one bite at a time thing. We're trying to constantly move there. And look, folks, a key component of that is getting the visibility, right? Because I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, right? And as we get started with zero trust, because there are so many areas, right? People try and go out around this without thinking about, one, where am I going to get the most value, for uptick in security, right? From an implementation standpoint. And secondly, a lot of them jump into it without visibility, right? And if you can't see what's happening now, building the policies around, because remember, we're thinking deny all, permit the good stuff being what we're seeing today. Again, this can be overly challenging without visibility. But I do want to highlight here that for me, one of the biggest places that I've seen value is stopping lateral movement, right? Stopping lateral movement inside your networks, right? Now, it's not just the lateral movement that gets into data exfiltration, it gets into a bunch of other stuff, but ultimately locking down the interior of your network is such a critical piece. But it's again a very, very important piece. Right? Some folks are like, start with identity, and I'm like, well, cool, but again, like table stakes for me is again locking down the interior of my network, right? And so when I start this, one of my first questions and the most important places I start with organizations I'm working on to build a zero trust strategy is, what is going on inside the network? And this sounds like a very easy question to answer, but the devil's always in the details, right? So when I say, for instance, I'm pointing to an application server, Mark, I want to bring you in here in a second to, tell me, have you seen this in the wild? What's the experience? But when I ask folks like, hey, what protocols does this server talk on? They're like, oh yeah, well that uses HTTP and it makes an outbound call here and also listens on this one port, and we need to support communications there. And then you ask them, is that it? And they're like, well, how does network visibility bring us to that, right? How do we get does network visibility help us there? And if so, how? And have you seen this with clients where they misunderstand what they really have in the network?
Oh, all the time. It's really common for us to kind of deploy systems inside networks and for the NetOps and SecOps teams to go, what the hell is that? I didn't know we had that on the network. What is that? And also, as we've seen, attackers are camouflaging what they're doing by, sending traffic that appears to be one thing, but actually is something else. Hiding it in DNS traffic or hiding beaconing in DNS traffic, that sort of thing that we saw. So yes, it happens all the time. In answer to your question.
Yeah. I mean, to throw an anecdote in here, I'll mention that, I used to do in my old job or my old business, we did a lot of merger and acquisition due diligence assessments. And one of the things we would do with that is go into the target organization, drop a network tap, just egress network tap, not even like east-west traffic, just north-south, right? Drop that in place and capture traffic and just look. I've had on multiple occasions a target organization claim I was fabricating traffic because they look and they're like, that's not from us. That's not us. And I'm like, dude, I have neither the time nor the desire, right, to go fabricate traffic to put in your, it's like, but that's the level of, because now we're just flat out like even denying this is ours, right? Level of misunderstanding about what's in some of these networks. And I suspect Michael's seen the same as well.
It's funny you describe it. We've been using the analogy internally lately of, historically, security was this castle moat security infrastructure, right? Everything outside the moat is bad. Everything inside the moat is good, and can be trusted. Well, when 93% of all attacks are phishing internally generated open doors, right? So to no fault of the people necessarily, no negligence or intentional, bad behavior. All these back doors being opened, your moat is leaking into the castle, right? Is maybe the analogy we run with here. And so I think, again, you nailed it when we opened this session about really learning what the east-west traffic is happening, because nobody that I've talked to fully knows they don't even know all the devices on their network, right? Let's just be honest, right? It's asset management. If you don't even know all the devices, there's no way in heck they know what all protocols and communications are happening, right? So that's where you've got to have that visibility that you described internally and start looking for some of those things, or at least be able to look. Maybe you don't start looking, you're just capable of doing it.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I actually advanced the slides. So you're like, the visibility. I'm like, yes, the visibility, right? Because it is so critically important. And Michael, I love, by the way, I'm totally stealing the moat is leaking into the castle analogy, because that is so apt, right? And separately from, or I guess maybe not separately, maybe tangentially to that, what have you. I think what you're saying just is spot on around asset discovery, because when I go talk to security leadership, that's a constant issue, right? Where they're like, well, we don't know all the assets on our network and we're trying, we're not there. And it's like, okay, but if you don't know those, right? Like, and that is the experience, that's what we've seen time and time again. My goodness, man, there is zero chance. And I mean, zero chance, right? That the communications going between all of those, right? So yeah.
But just to chime in and add on it, that's only gotten worse, right? I mean, I've been in the networking space for 25 years, and company after company I've visited have been trying to do inventory asset management. And that's always been a challenge historically, right? Especially in large environments. Now think about how additionally complex it is with, hybrid cloud environments, IoT devices, things you didn't even think about being on the network are now on the network. And they all have potentially vulnerability points, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so that has just exponentially exploded the problem.
Oh yeah, you talk IoT, right? Like, not to sidetrack too much here, right. but that's such a great point, right? Because IoT is another one, and insert whatever acronym you want there. Like, I learned about MIoT or IoT of IOMT, Internet of Medical Things, right? I'm like, we did not need this. They were previously called medical devices, but okay, cool. But like, I remember working in an organization where we're like, holy goodness, somebody is attacking your IV pumps, right? They're telnetting into these things. Yes, telnet. This is only a couple of short years ago, right? Telnetting into these things. And they're like, oh, no. That's, because you talk about vulnerabilities, this thing had a hard-coded root password that you could not change because of course it did. Couldn't disable telnet either. And then you come to learn that indeed, no, the management application for this was obscenely expensive. And so somebody had whipped together some expect scripts, right, to go and telnet into these things to get statuses, and saved the org $250,000 a year, right, in licensing, which is neat until it's, like, you don't know, is it attack traffic? Is it? And then you get into all this craziness. It's just this explosion of devices. The problem has definitely gotten worse. No question. I do want to note here, and this is another one of these, like, take this point to the bank, right? Because I've been there, done that. I not only have the T-shirt, but I've got the battle scars, right? And that's over denial of service, right? Yeah. You have to have visibility. This is the reality. If you are building a zero trust networking deployment, you have to have good visibility. The organizations that basically that have good network visibility and historical network visibility, meaning they can look back more than a week, more than a couple of days. Like, nobody starts zero trust networking like, well, let's not look at anything. Now they go and deploy something, but they're on a timeline, right? They don't have any historical network data. And so literally they're just collecting what it looks like right this second, and they consistently miss stuff. The once a month, the once a quarter, the weird stuff, right? And every one of those is a denial of service. Everything you miss is a denial of service. And that's something to really let sink in. It's one of the ways that I get folks to understand on the, particularly on the business unit side, right? Why this is taking too long, and certainly, and why we need additional investments in visibility. Because when I explain to them that everything we miss, right, is going to create a denial of service condition, will prevent them from doing their job until we pick that back up and circle it back around, right? Meaning, see that thing, they complain about it, we study it, we understand what changes we need to make in the configuration, hopefully don't break something else, and then implement them, they're broken, right? And so that's something to keep in mind here. Again, have lots of battle scars around this, mostly from people pushing me and saying, where I'm like, whoa, this high degree of likelihood we're going to break something. And I go, and then we break something. They're like, why'd you break it? Right? Certainly, we've all lived through that, right? At some point in security, and if you haven't, you eventually will. So I'm big on examining network comms as they exist today. And that helps me bootstrap a zero trust networking policy with sets of configurations that are unlikely to cause outages. Now, Mark actually brought this up a minute ago, right? In that, sometimes you have threat actors that are using legitimate looking stuff in the network. Right? They're in your baseline, right? I hear this every time we talk about baselining. I understand it. I get it. Whatever, right? At the end of the day, if I can get to a spot where the only bad stuff that's allowed in the network is the bad stuff that's happening right now, that is still a net positive over where I was before, right? And so this is one of these things, I don't try and tackle that problem on day one, right? So another, lesson learned over many years, right, is I don't try to tackle that on day one because meh, right? So this really helps me. The other thing I'll note here, another sales point, although realistically, you shouldn't need this, right? Zero trust networking solves change control problems for me. Once I have a good zero trust networking, now there's lots of other zero trust components that don't fix this for me, right? But if you're a security professional and you're thinking like, man, our change control process sucks, right? And it would be so much easier if folks would go through that process, right? This kind of forces it, because anything new in the network, talking to something, either on it's a new device, it's a new port on an existing or new protocol, communication, new destination, you name it, right? A change in that configuration, because it's set to deny all, immediately forces them to come back to change control, right? My system integrators, system owners, whoever's implementing that change, they have to go through change control, period. And so this fixes that problem too. So if you're looking for ways to get more buy-in around this, great spot to go there. It's also worth mentioning some organizations need to re-architect their network segmentation because you need policy enforcement points, or PEPs, for zero trust networking. Realistically here, this is VLANs, right? And man, I'm bumping into folks who are like, Jake, no, segmentation doesn't use VLANs, it uses agents. And I'm like, no, I mean, I guess it can, right? Micro-segmentation, but there's 4,094 VLANs available, right? Like that's before we get into crazy spanning tree stuff, right? And I see Mark, actually both Mark and Michael smiling the second I said spanning tree there. I'm guessing we both got that T-shirt too. But But yeah, so I guess I might kind of pivot over here. How many organizations do you see that end up needing to re-architect portions of their network to really get into good zero trust networking?
I would say the vast majority, wouldn't you, Michael?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, kind of coming back to your earlier story about the hospital devices, right? I had the privilege of being on a panel at the Billington Cyber Summit, where one of the co-panelists with me was Jessica Wilkerson, who's a senior policy advisor for the FDA. Mm-hmm. And part of that discussion was around the lifespan of a lot of medical devices, right? And she was talking about, she writes standards for these types of things. And so many medical devices in a hospital are, 10, 15 years old. And they're always getting new stuff in, but they've got legacy stuff. And a lot of the legacy stuff doesn't support endpoint monitoring and things like that, right? So where I'm going with this, back to tying it to your specific here on the VLAN, is you've now got all these unsecured legacy devices on standard hospital WAN or LAN segments. And this is where this segmentation really needs to come into play, right? Of limit certain devices of a certain type to be on certain subnets, certain VLANs, to really be able to control things. You've got to start thinking about what is connected to what segments of your network, so that you can really start to have those walled gardens, right? And this just fits exactly with what you're talking about in terms of VLANing, right?
Yeah. The way I always analogize, and by the way, that's fantastic too. If there's a thing that keeps me up at night, it's having to go to the hospital, right? Like, and knowing all the connected devices and whatnot. Because realistically, like that, yeah, wow. But the way I always analogize it is, when you have a big flat network, you don't really have a way to enforce policy, right? It's like having a whole bunch of people and kind of like hoping that they somehow queue up, right? When in fact we haven't created the lines, right? We've not drawn the lines on the field, and VLANs effectively allow us to draw the lines that either open or close the gate. Without those lines, or closing the gate doesn't matter, right? Without a fence in the first place, it just doesn't matter. The VLANs create the fence, right? Our opportunities to open and shut the gate selectively and selectively allow people through. Those are ACLs, right? Effectively at our policy enforcement points, right? But we don't get that without the benefit of first creating the fences, right? So
Ron Wood from NIST, Michael did an interview with Ron Wood, and he used a lovely analogy, I thought, which was, think of it like you've got your house, you've got your front door, you always lock that. But once people are inside the house, they can go where they want. And right. But if you were to lock the doors of all of the rooms inside the house so that you could only get in if you had a key, it would it might slow you down, but it would certainly slow attackers down and give you the chance to kind of detect what was going on. And that, I thought that was a really good analogy, creating these kind of borders around rooms in the house, and only letting the people into the kitchen who should be in the kitchen, which does not include my son.
No, I love that. And speaking again as a former threat actor, right? Like, one of the things I always have to remind people not to do, right? They're like, oh, well, they'll take that analogy too far, where they're like, well, I know how to, maneuver around, and I know how to, and I'm like, great, your threat actor doesn't, right? And I'm speaking as one, they may learn, but they'll create a lot of noise doing it. Just to address a question that we had in the chat here too, somebody notes that, yes, maybe around new devices and new applications, change control might be solved, but it may not solve problems where removing devices and closing holes. Yeah, 100%, you're right on that. Hopefully have secondary controls in place, but I'm not going to let perfect stand in the way of good enough. I'm going to take the as you note in the question, the much higher risk point, which is the introducing new stuff we didn't know about, versus the life cycling stuff that we that ultimately leaving holes open effectively when we've removed a device. There's now an allow rule that's there that probably should no longer be. So you are correct about that. So I do want to note here then, as we carry forward as well, network telemetry is just huge, right? And I want to be specific about the type of network telemetry here, that it's packets, right? And I want to talk about why as well. But look, for me, this all starts with filtering out the known, right? Yes, my system admins, my system owners got me to a point of, hey, here are the following 3 or 4 things are expected. Great, filter those out. And I'm going to start with the weird stuff because that's what ends up biting me. It's the stuff that people aren't thinking about. And so in most cases, then they're not seeing, because they're not thinking about it, they're not seeing the immediate impact of it. Or if they are seeing some impact, they're not connecting it to that missing network traffic that we're now blocking because we deny all permit by exception. And so ideally here, I've got a lot of east-west, meaning internal, network capture. Even if you can't get full east-west network capture, again, ingress and egress from your data centers and your VPCs, your virtual private clouds. I don't care whether your data center is on-prem or in a cloud at the end of the day, wherever the servers happen to be. Getting that locked down first is a great first step if I don't have full east-west visibility. And this is where I definitely want to get Michael back in here as well. I've dealt with a lot of organizations using NetFlow as a starting point, and I do too, right? Because oftentimes it's all I have. NetFlow is great and it resolves that transport protocol and port number. I've got that level of granularity, but can you speak to some of the challenges you've seen customers have when they're dealing with that and not ground truth, which is the actual data?
Yeah, and there's a couple of examples already talked about here. Is you definitely see those initial communication connections and source destination IPs, things like that, the basics, shall we say? But then you need to get at that next level so you can look inside that DNS traffic and find out, is it really legitimate DNS traffic? Is it going to legitimate DNS servers, right? Or is it coming from unknown hosts in some unusual parts of the world, right? Type of thing. And so looking at the embedded traffic is one piece. The other thing, you mentioned early on about lateral movement. A lot of times things, send out feelers to try and scan the network and things like that. And then once they identify other hosts, as Mark mentioned, I believe it was, creating beacons to other things. Okay, now you've got spreading types of traffic, right? So that may not all come from that initial NetFlow connection, disconnection transaction that you have recorded in the NetFlow data, because now you're following other things that were initiated, right? So that's that one. And then the last one I'll hit on is really, again, you mentioned it early on, is the data exfiltration. As you know, with NetFlow traffic, you're not going to have the payload traffic, right? It's just the headers, it's just the basics. And if you need to know that what was being exfiltrated, what was being taken out to this external host, you're only going to have that if you have the payload, right? And that's really critical, right? To be able to validate, right? If you're in a compliance situation and saying, was there PII data taken, or was there customer credit card information, any of that type of stuff, right? You've got to have that payload.
I'd add another couple of points to it, just about NetFlow. I mean, as you say, if you don't have anything else, Jake, NetFlow is kind of useful, but it's not kind of cast iron either, because NetFlow is often sampled, and while that is okay from the point of view of kind of understanding generally the traffic on your network, to forecast demand and identify bottlenecks and stuff, it's not so good when it comes to security, because you can just miss stuff, right? So that's the first issue. And then the second issue is it also depends how you're generating that net flow. If you're using network elements like routers and switches to generate your net flow, and you suffer a denial of service attack, the first thing that often happens is people turn off the net flow generation, so
yes.
which is precisely when you need it, right? Or it just simply drops stuff, and that means that you're losing visibility at the time you need it most. And then in addition to that, as Michael said, it is only summary information, so you're missing the payload. That's it.
And you already brought up, right, like the beaconing over DNS, for instance, right, as a great example of that. And there are myriad others, right? And in fact, in our earlier webcast series, we've covered a ton of those, right? Web shell is a great example of that too. Again, the hard part here with NetFlow is what about the unknown? When I see a random high port connecting to a random high port, I have no context on that. And it's like, what is that? I can't rely on port number because neither end of it's a well-known port, right? So what is it? I need more granular there. And Mark, you brought this up first, I think, so you win the prize there, right? But threat actors disguising their traffic, right? Either on a non-standard port number or masquerading their traffic as something that's legitimate, obviously something that is trivial to do if all I have from a visibility standpoint is NetFlow, and then when I'm able to shine that brighter light of packet capture on it, it changes the game because I've got ground truth, the actual network comms. I know that you've implemented Bro and Zeek, and I'll spin back to this in a couple of minutes, Bro/Zeek, in your EndaceProbe, your appliance. But I do want to highlight for folks here that if you don't have packet capture initially, or you can't store it, or you can't whatever, a great middle ground is capturing additional metadata, and I suspect that's why it's in the probe today. But some metadata you can pull out just to give an idea of stuff you wouldn't see in NetFlow. For instance, I can go look and say, well, that's port 445. That's probably server message block or SMB, and here I can see the SMB shares that are being accessed and the file names that are being accessed, and in what way in some cases, right? Pulling apart with Zeek, maybe I'm looking at URLs that are being accessed versus just that you made a connection to something that looks like an HTTP server. So that granularity of data. I will come in before we talk about Bro and note that there are some downsides, right? To this, and certainly for internal zero trust networking inventory. We do still have the decryption problem. I'm probably not going through a TLS gateway, break inspect kind of gateway, east-west. The other good news, though, is that I'm less likely to need it because my internal east-west traffic is less likely to be encrypted in the first place for a lot of reasons, performance being a big one. But my biggest issue that I bump into here, right, for folks that are like, oh, don't worry, I've got 6 months of Bro or whatever, right, logs, where do I get the answers if the enhanced metadata that Bro or Zeek has elevated to me creates new questions? If I'm like, well, that looks really interesting, what the heck is that, right? Where do I turn to get those answers? And Mark, I'm going to bring you back in here. I know you've done a lot of work with Bro and Zeek. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely hits the nail on the head. Metadata is really useful for identifying kind of anomalies and raising flags, but it doesn't give you the information that you then need to understand exactly what it is. And that's why packets are important. The reason why we implemented Zeek on the probe is that it gives you the ability. Most of our customers are keeping weeks to months of data on the probes, of full packet data, and often that is break and inspect. So they will have break and inspect in place, and they'll be storing the unencrypted traffic. And having Zeek there allows you to kind of go back and ask questions of stuff that happened a day ago or 2 days ago or a week ago or even a month ago. For example, if you saw that there was some sort of file transfer that looks suspicious and you want to be able to kind of look deeper at that, you can use Zeek to reconstruct the file from the packets. And then you've got the actual, sample of the malware, if that's what it is, and you can identify what sort of breed of malware that is, and even kind of track back to how the hell did it get there in the first place.
Right.
So yeah, that's where Zeek comes in really useful, and it does generate some really good, rich log traffic, log data.
On the sticking to the zero trust, because the malware use case is like, that's an obvious one for me, right? Spinning back to the zero trust side, right? What about, Michael, I'll bring you in on this. What about like mystery applications, right? Where it's like, that's the DNS server. And then you find out it's the DNS and this server and this other server and a bunch of other things that have technical deaded their way on. You're nodding like you bumped into this. Have you seen this?
No, absolutely. Well, we've helped customers find some examples of spoof DNS servers, right? Is the most simple example, right where you're at. Yeah. It's pinging a specific IP address, claiming to be DNS. Now it's just getting other types of payloads, right? In that example. And the other thing you can start to see is user level traffic, in the sense of users associated with specific applications, being able to filter that type of information as well. So I think that's the other way to look at it.
Oh, that's another fantastic use case. Definitely. Well, look, hopefully it should be clear here. Packet capture is the gold standard, period. I think we've kind of highlighted why NetFlow is necessary, maybe but not sufficient. Zeek, again, same thing, Zeek/Pro, necessary, not sufficient. At the end of the day, right, packet capture becomes that gold standard. We can always go ask those questions. One of the things that some folks don't recognize, I want to make sure it's clear here, is that you can take packet capture if you have it and generate NetFlow from it. You can generate, Zeek logs or Bro logs from that packet capture data. And so you can use that to get that high level summary using those very rich logs that have been output, and use that to down select the majority of the traffic away, and then only inspect at a packet level the stuff that you don't understand, right? And this rapidly accelerates your any investigation, obviously, but then specifically in the zero trust networking, where I'm really looking for all of the weird outliers, right? Those are the hard ones to get, at least to get to in my experience. And I'd be remiss not to mention a couple of the features on the probe. We get into filtering traffic. It's volumes and volumes of packet capture data. How do I filter it meaningfully? And the answer is not throw it in Wireshark. One does not simply filter gigabytes of data in Wireshark. There's no such thing as the simple part there. The probe, which is the name for like the appliance, right? The packet capture, storage and analysis appliance. This has a lot of high-level filtering functions, far beyond what I can get in, just simply in NetFlow data itself. And then I want to talk quickly as well, since we're talking zero trust and knowing what applications are on our network. Michael, I'm going to bring you in on this for just a second here on the application layer filtering. Are you seeing your customers using this to find only the stuff they're looking for? Or do you see them also using the other use case of, I know what's here, now show me the everything else?
No, and you hit it on the head. And again, this is why we're liking to do some of these sessions, right, with you and some other PCAP experts in the industry, is highlighting the powerful search capability that you have. You filter out all the stuff you're expecting, and now what do you see? And this is when you start finding some of these maybe unusual or slightly obscure different protocols and application. And you're like, I didn't know that was running across my network. So absolutely, in one of our earlier sessions was proving the negative, right? And so I think being able to simplify your investigation is really why we're trying to stress how important packet capture is, right? Because it does accelerate some of these really hard problems really quickly, because you can take out all the known. Now you're left with the unknown. It's a much smaller subset, and you can get through and trace through things across your network if you have a network-wide capturing infrastructure, right? And that's really our approach. And one more comment or add I'd throw in, Jake, that we actually, I don't know if we've even talked about, we've actually added or released the functionality to create NetFlow data, right? So from our probe, we can actually generate, it's called EndaceFlow, NetFlow data to help, whether it be your SIM, whether it be some of your other tools or applications. So, I think Mark mentioned it earlier about a lot of times devices, if you're expecting NetFlow from devices, that's going to be shut off in the time of an attack. Well, so if you have an out of band system like us recording the data for your ultimate forensics, but we're also generating NetFlow data, that again creates resiliency and redundancy in your infrastructure to avoid these blind spots of outages, right, so to speak.
Yeah, it also the other key thing with EndaceFlow is that it is, well, you can set it to be sampled, but by default it's not, right? So for every packet, it's going to be examined and related to a flow, the end result being you will see every flow that happens on your network, and we can generate it, very, very high speed. So you don't miss stuff, which you can tend to do with NetFlow otherwise.
Definitely. And so I'd be remiss not to mention another, a couple of feature here before we dive into doing some actual packet analysis, but or at least some filtering and whatnot. But filtering on this flow level data is just fantastic, and the ability to do that, and ultimately either filter things in or in some cases out. Again, if I'm trying to look for the everything else, this is me filtering out. There's a number of apps that run on the probe that allow you to do more advanced filtering and then take just that result and send that additional whatever was left over packets, right? Generate a PCAP file there and send that to Grow and Wireshark, both of which will run directly on the probe itself. Within effectively a virtual machine on a probe. This is really significant if you're working in a low bandwidth environment, which I kind of talk about here a little bit, because I can run Zeek and I can go back and pull. I want you to think about this for a second. If I'm generating, if I've got, a remote office that's got a 1 megabit uplink, right, which is, this stuff still happens, folks, in 2022 all over the world, unfortunately. If I'm looking at weeks to months of packet capture, I don't want to try and drag all that home. I only want to bring home the interesting stuff. And here, even just to get that first level analysis, right, I can already do my filtering. Then I can take just the filtered sample, send it on the probe, right, to Bro Zeek, right, and then I can bring just the logs, my text logs, super compressed and awesomely fast, back home to do some analysis on. I can actually look at some of it on the probe as well, which is pretty cool, but I'm just bringing back anything specifically of interest. Here you see an example of effectively, this is the weird log, exactly what it sounds like. It's weird traffic, right? And so this can be a big helper for me too, in just looking for, I don't want to say oddness necessarily, right? But anyway. And so I was talking earlier about like more advanced metadata, and here's an example of FTP, right? And seeing specifically what's being requested, right? And from where. And this is stuff, again, I'm never going to see this in NetFlow. What I'm seeing there effectively in NetFlow is the fact of the connection, how many bytes were transferred, no enhanced metadata like this, right? So for those not familiar with this, wanted to bring this to the forefront. Now, once I have that packet capture, right? So I'm not using any of these tools. How do I get started with this, right? If I've got packet capture, Wireshark, it's all about the statistics, right? And so I'm going to bounce out of momentarily here. Let's see, bounce out of this. Here we go. Discard those, and let me go grab a packet capture. Now, this is it's a publicly available packet capture. We did not go generate a bunch of multiple networks of traffic. This actually comes from a challenge from the first conference. So again, publicly available, something that you can go download if you wanted to go and play with play with this as well. But one of the things that I want to highlight here is the statistics box, and far too few people use this, right? Now, again, you have the option to use this directly on the probe as well, but a great place to start if you're starting in zero trust networking and you're taking kind of just that initial sample, right? Is what does it look like? What does my protocol hierarchy look like, right? How much TCP versus UDP, and then what is it, right? That's here present in the present in the summary, present in the packet capture here. It gives you a good summary of that. And this gives you a good little high level, what is it, right? Now, again, if I've already filtered with the probe, I don't have to deal with this because I already have, well, I guess I still am going to know what is it, but I filtered out, again, the known, right? The easily known stuff. And now what I'm looking for, again, is the oddball. Two others that I want to introduce you to if you haven't seen these before. One is called Conversations, and the other one is called Endpoints. Now, I tend to start a little bit with my endpoints first, because what it allows me to do is take a look at who's on or who's present in the packet capture, not specifically who's talking to who. And so with endpoints, I can kind of come through and get an idea of the IP addressing scheme. A problem that I have seen again and again and again and again are NAT gateways inside east-west networks. I've also seen folks that have the mystery subnet, right? So they don't have a NAT gateway, but the convention is the 192.168s. Right. That's what they're using for their internal addressing. But then you see some 10 dot stuff and you're like, what is that? And sometimes folks go, well, we don't have any 10 dots on our network. And then you find out it's like, oh no, that's that special network over there that nobody else is supposed to touch or whatever. Right. So again, this is a great starting point for me. Again, when I start looking at NAT gateways, one of the things that I use to identify this honestly is conversations, right? So I'll get back to the conversation side here in a second, but you can see at a very high level, how much data is being transferred, back and forth. And again, this is a total of like 30 megs of PCAP intentionally so that we can filter it quickly. Because as I mentioned before, you do not want to wait on stuff to filter. I've certainly been in that boat before, and even knowing better, I've been in that boat before. Real quick, I want to show you the conversation stuff as well. All right. And just to bring up, basically just to bring up our conversations now, instead of seeing one line per endpoint, I'm seeing one line for every connection that endpoint has made. Now, I say connection, of course, that works here for TCP. If we're in UDP, of course, that's connectionless. And so what you're seeing here effectively is what Wireshark can identify as a flow. But this gives you a good idea of who's talking to what. On what ports, right? Just as a really good high level start. Now, I will mention here, and in fact, I'll bring back the slides here for a second. I do want you to note that everything that I'm doing here generally, right, is somewhere in the slides, right? Protocol hierarchy, endpoints, conversations, those are all there. One of the first things that I do when I'm starting to get some network visibility, like what do I have, right, is start with a not TCP or UDP or ARP, right? Now, what I'm doing here, I'm not saying not TCP or not UDP or not, I'm globally putting those together, the or, and then negating that. And the reason for that is that every, there are lots of packets that aren't, for instance, if I said not TCP or not UDP, right? Every packet is one of those two things, right? Or is every TCP packet is not UDP, right? And so again, I end up catching stuff in the filter I probably didn't intend. And so this is a great first pass filter for me. And I know that this is small down here, but that's why it's back on the slides. You end up with 1.7%, right? Total traffic, right? So this is the everything else, right? Now, by the way, I'm going to resolve or basically go up a couple of levels on the everything else in a second, because this is just I need to look at what my UDP and my TCP traffic are, but this is at least a good place for me, to start. And I can see then, okay, well, I see a bunch of IGMP. Well, I'm just going to add that in here, all right? And say, and not IGMP. Oh, you just saw this turn yellow. Hand to heaven, I did not do this intentionally, right? This yellow bar, seriously, hand to heaven, didn't do this intentionally. Live demo for the win. But when you look at this yellow bar, Wireshark is saying, you have a syntactically correct query that is probably wrong, or a syntactically correct filter that is probably broken. And it is, right? Because this is creating this problem that I was talking about before, where lots of other packets are not IGMP and they're all going to be filtered in now. Okay, so let me get rid of this, say or, and now it goes back to green and it's like, got it. Okay, we can do that, right? And now once I filter this out, we're left with very, very, very minimal. And here, this is all IPv6. By the way, folks, if you're not using IPv6, freaking disable IPv6, right? I don't know how else to say that. I keep seeing it again and again and again. It's increased attack surface no matter what. And all of your machines are getting these FE80 addresses, right? Which are the equivalent of the automatic private IP address, and the 169.254 is an IPv4, right? Get rid of it on a local subnet. Threat actors, I've seen it. I've done it, right? For that matter, you don't want to be that. Don't want to be in that position. Just disable it. Okay, so we don't have anything else weird besides IGMP. This is really, really important, by the way, right? Particularly in manufacturing environments. Healthcare is another one. To see some weird, non-standard, not IP or some higher level or some other transport layer besides TCP or UDP. Michael's shaking his head. He's like, yep, seen that. Right?
Well, we had a funny story, and I don't remember the customer, but it's a funny story I was working with where it was an OT environment, right? So an industrial place, right? And very low bandwidth, low protocols, very specific protocol exchanges. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the scenario was very similar to what you just described. Mm-hmm. They discovered that there was, and they had a PCAP, and I don't know where they got it from, where they discovered that there was Xbox traffic. Somebody had plugged in an Xbox, somebody watching these monitors overnight and on in the break room, right? It was something totally safe and legit in theory, had plugged in an Xbox into the infrastructure, and the Xbox was doing updates. Mm-hmm. So they had Xbox traffic updates on this network that was an OT environment.
Sure. Yep.
Right. And that traffic stuck out like a sore thumb, as you can imagine. Right. So again, proving the negative or proving the anomalies in this case of what you shouldn't be expecting.
That's it. And here, I want to be super clear. The reason we're doing this in the context of zero trust network is we haven't lost the forest for the trees, right? Because we're not in the trees, we're in the weeds. But right now, but the reason we're doing this is to get a complete inventory for what we're going to allow in our network access control lists, right? Because, again, until we know what that is, we can't move to a deny all posture without creating outages, right? And the scream test is a really, really bad way to deploy zero trust.
And again, Jake, just to chime in on that, you don't want to deny all to hospital devices, right, where patients need care.
It's more than a scream test, yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to be able to, and I saw there was a question in the Q&A about, do you have any examples of medium to large organizations that have transitioned to this? And yeah, we've seen it in the healthcare industry in particular with, segmentation and VLANs. You take very specific parts of your network, you separate it off, you take baby steps, right? Eating the elephant one bite at a time, because you can't do it from scratch. As I think the question kind of refers to, doing it from a clean slate is a challenge in itself, but from a historical state, that's a whole nother challenge. And so you take very specific, whether it be medical devices, subnets of your network, floors of your network, the maternity ward versus the OR systems, and just segment is how I've seen it done with some of the medium to larger organizations.
Yeah, and Michael, to your point, man, that is solid advice. And I'm happy to hear somebody besides me saying, don't try and tackle it all right this second, right? Because you'll drown under the weight of it, right? It's incremental steps. Don't let perfect stand in the way of good enough. If you've got that legacy network, right, identify where are the crown jewels, going back to your moat and castle analogy, right?
Right.
Your crown jewels are sitting in the castle. Where is that? Let's build a moat around that, right? And so if it's a hospital, my number one is where are your patient connected devices? Right. Segment those first. And then now we have to answer the question for that next piece, right? Can I say segment those, meaning build a wall around those? What in the business network, right? Which is, like the billing, the whatnot administration network, what there needs to talk to a biomed device, right? Or a patient safety device, right? And if you're not in healthcare, pick manufacturing. What in your business network needs to talk to the manufacturing floor? And it, the answer there should probably be close to nothing. And even then, on very, very specific ports and protocols. And then that next step, right, is okay, do I want to segment internally there to prevent, to your point, the maternity ward, right, from talking to the operating room? Or is my next best uplift in security, does that come from something else? And so pick one of those, right? Pick whatever is going to be the most impactful next and move there. And I'll just call out here again, there's not all ports and protocols created equally, right? Blocking some obscure protocol versus locking down SMB, night and day difference. I think SMB is going to be the win, right? So,
back one more add on to your hospital example, Jake, is not all hospital devices are equally critical, right? I mean, a blood pressure machine might not be as critical as a heart monitoring machine or an oxygenation machine. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not describing the machines properly. But the point being is not all devices need to have the same level of criticality.
But by dumb luck, I actually am a paramedic. Well, was a paramedic. I actually have the tattoo, believe it or not. So I can tell you 100% the device that is above all the other ones is the defibrillator. Right. Because it is, when you have a Wi-Fi connected defibrillator that you can cardiovert somebody from over Wi-Fi, yes, that one is the one we want to protect for first. Yes. Somebody else asked about the importance of visibility for ZTNA, and I want to make sure we don't confuse ZTNA, network access, right? Which is how do I get into the network, right? So our traditional VPN, from zero trust networking, which is more once you're connected to the network, right? How do you ultimately how do you maneuver? How do you what communications can you have there? But can you share your thoughts on network visibility importance post CTNA implementation? Yeah, can we do it for policy validation? Oh, 100%, right? Like you got to remember that, and I'm going to kick the ball to Michael and Mark here in a second, but for me, the visibility challenge never ends, right? Like post implementation, I absolutely need to be able, because every alert I get, right, is either a threat actor or something we didn't catch in our configuration. And visibility matters. It's paramount there to be able to answer that question. Which of those two is it? Michael, I'll kick it over to you first. What do you think there post implementation?
Yeah, no, the point is actually really great in terms of, first of all, you've got to limit network access, right? So if you have a BYOD type of network and you're just allowing any device in the world on, okay, so they can get network connectivity and they can get out to the public network, but they can't get anywhere else. Right. Then you authenticate them as a user or as an application, and then, okay, maybe they can get to the next layer, but they're still not getting to, critical subnets or VLANs of your infrastructure, right? So I think it's the layers of the onion, and I think, the question is spot on. There's and you hit it right up front, is there's basic network access, and then then what can you go do and how far can you get, right? And that's when you start filtering at the application level, at the port level, at the user level, right? So this is where you automatically are getting into identity management controls, if they're going to go anywhere but that basic, guests of patient network, right? And you see this in a lot of environments. We keep talking about hospitals, but you go into retail stores, and the retail store has their corporate network, but most of them offer free Wi-Fi to the people roaming the Home Depot aisles, right? So those are different parts of the subnet, and again, different levels of criticality in this scenario, right?
Yeah, definitely. Mark, do you have anything to add there?
Just that, as you point out, it's an ongoing process, right? And if you are in the network operations center or the security team and you get a call from the CFO saying, why the hell can I not get to X when I clearly should be able to, and you are sure that it is the CFO, of course, you need to be able to answer that question pretty damn quickly. And, so the ability to kind of be able to see what it was that caused that connection not to be allowed is crucial. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of very unhappy, potentially very senior people jumping down your throat, which is not good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to Naruto run through a couple more of these slides here, but I want to make sure like it's contextualized for the folks that are going back through this and watching the recording here. But I do want to note here, right, like an easy spot for me to start is filter out. Again, I expect 80 and 443. It's kind of table stakes. I'll go back and identify some of the devices that should never be talking that, or never talking that to generic destinations. But that's a later thing for me. This starts with the inventorying, the weird, the known, and pretty quickly here, just by filtering that out, and then going back to my favorite conversations tab here. And by the way, too, I can go to the conversations piece, and then I can go look at and say, okay, only limited to the display filter, right? So I've already gotten rid of the 80 and 443, the big stuff. Right now, again, I'm going to rinse, lather, repeat, and iterate on this, building that filter back out. But a couple of things, not just, could be attack traffic, could be just weirdness, right? But hey, that weird port 22 with a source port of 6,000, that could be random, certainly, but it jumps out at me. Did certainly. I may not be familiar with port 2869, right? And that may be a spot that I need to deep dive a little bit further on. And come back to that one just as well. Am I going to come back to that in a second? I thought I had another. Okay, no, I don't. So that 2869 is UPnP, right? Which probably shouldn't be on my corporate network, right? In fact, if it is, that's probably an issue that I'm identifying now, that I have a bunch of this Soho kind of stuff there that shouldn't be the enterprise network, right? Separately, I do want to note here that I can go in and look, and maybe I don't have the beginning of a particular connection in this packet capture, but I may have it, if I've been capturing for some period of time, I've got it elsewhere, right? So again, this is in the follow TCP stream. I don't see the initial handshake, right? Likewise, I may be in a spot where I've got the whole thing, right? Here I've got a random high to a random high connection. this pivots right back to something Michael mentioned. I think it was Michael. My apologies if it was Mark. Where it's the what happened right before this. I've got this weird connection. I can't explain it. What happened before it, and can I get some visibility there? And worst case, I go back to the endpoint the endpoint that generated the traffic, but I'm at least pointed back to, I know what I'm looking for there, not just, oh my gosh, generic traffic, right? So wanted to highlight just a couple of filters that we can do and put in place. I will wrap up with a couple of closing thoughts because we're pushing towards end of time. If you're not doing zero trust yet is the key word. You will be pushed on to do zero trust, because when the president's talking about it, everybody's talking about it, period. All right. The more granular network data you get, the more visibility you have, the easier it's going to be for you to implement and then maintain and audit those zero trust configurations over time. That's huge. Folks, if I had $1 for every time that somebody's like, hey, our firewall logs will do it, I wouldn't be here talking in a webinar. I'd have my own private island in the Bahamas, man. I don't know what else to say, right? Firewall logs are not sufficient. They are a great place for a lot of stuff, but zero trust networking just isn't it. And there are myriad problems there. Again, network visibility for the win. Gentlemen, I'll kick it to you for just a quick, because we're actually a minute over time here. But any closing thoughts here to wrap us up?
Yeah, just one. You mentioned the White House mandate or the executive order about zero trust. I think there's, it's not a coincidence that if you read down further into that and you look at what you're required to keep in the way of evidence, federal agencies have to keep a minimum of 72 hours of full packet capture as of February next year. So that's no accident. That's because there's a recognition that without it, you can't do what you need to do. Simple as that.
I know the person who got that in there. So yes,
oh, really?
100%. That is exactly why it's.
Please introduce us. We'd love to shake his hand or her hand.
Sure, Michael.
No, I think you guys nailed it. Our goal is to show how valuable the packet data can be in solving these problems. And again, it's a journey. It's not a switch. You've got to take steps. And if we can help with some of your cybersecurity infrastructure, we'd certainly be happy to be a part of it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, gentlemen, I'm obviously going to pass it back here to wrap the webinar out, pass it to Mary, but thank you so much again. Seriously, my gratitude to you for bringing not just this content, but all the other content you brought to the SANS community. And the way you've done it has been fantastic. So thank you for being a great partner.
We're keen to carry on. So anybody who wants to get us to do stuff next year, let us know what you want.
Awesomeness. Appreciate it, folks. Mary?
Thank you so much, Jake, Michael, and Mark, for your great presentation, and to Endace for sponsoring this webcast, which helps to bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.